Hello, everyone. It's my honor to talk to you for a few minutes about the Sermon on the Mount, this seminal teaching of Jesus that we find very early in the story of Matthew's gospel. And what Jesus is doing there, what's he trying to accomplish, what it means for your life and for my life. And the place we ought to start is, why should you care about the Sermon on the Mount? I mean, there are a lot of sermons in the world throughout church history, but clearly this one from Jesus, in Matthew's accounting, his first sermon, that's going to be really key. And what you need to know about the Sermon on the Mount is that it's probably not a sermon in the way that you think about it, that Jesus gave all of these teachings at once. He might have, but what I want you to think about is them in a bigger context than just what Matthew says at the beginning, when Matthew says that he sat down and began to teach, and then this is what he taught. So that's one way to look at it, but a better and bigger frame for what he's saying is that these are the things that Jesus talked about all the time. Much of this is captured again in Luke 6. And if you wrap your arms around the Sermon on the Mount, what you'll begin to see is that the topics that Jesus brings up and the way that Jesus teaches and the way that Jesus sees the world keeps coming up over and over and over again. And so one frame to think about the Sermon on the Mount is kind of a beginner's guide to discipleship. These are the topics, the aspects of life with God that Jesus talks about all the time. And what I want you to know about that is that Jesus is talking about reality. And so what is reality? Reality is what you run into when you discover that you're wrong. You can believe whatever you want to. We all believe things that aren't actually reality. And then when we run into reality, where it's not what we thought it was, not what we were told it was, that's reality. So Jesus sets out to teach his disciples and everybody else that would follow him what are the most important aspects of life. And every great teacher, every great philosophy throughout history has done this, has tried to outline 4 big questions. And so I want to start with the first 2 big questions. The first big question that Jesus is addressing in the Sermon on the Mount is, what is real? That's an important question because you had the experience of discovering that something wasn't actually what you thought it was. Just think about how big of a question that is. What is real? Are you a physical body or are you a spiritual body? The answer to that question changes the way you go about life. And the second big question is, who is well off? Who is truly blessed? So when we approach these topics, we have to look at what Matthew's gospel is doing in the big picture. Those first 4 chapters of Matthew are answering the question, where does Jesus come from? And then the Sermon on the Mount, which takes up the next 3 chapters, are about what Jesus is teaching. This person who has come into the world, what is he teaching now? And the Sermon on the Mount is your guideline for what a faithful disciple should look like. So, reality. Reality is what you run into when you discover that you're wrong. And Jesus' answer to the question of what is reality is that God is real and God's kingdom is real. And the second question is, who is well off? And the answer to that is, whoever lives within the kingdom of God. It's not about your conditions at a present moment. It's not about your birth. It's not about your job or your wealth, but anyone who lives in the kingdom of God, because there is the present availability to live inside that kingdom. Bad religion comes to us in 2 ways. Bad religion comes the first way, and it tells us that everything is about the future. It's about where you go or what happens after you die. But another way that bad religion comes to us is that it tells us it's all about the present, that the only thing matters is what is happening right now. And the Sermon on the Mount is going to tell us that it's both. That this is how people who live inside the kingdom behave. And so instead of starting at the beginning, when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, the best way to do that is to start at the end. And this is what Jesus says at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. This is chapter 7, verse 24. He says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them." Now that's important because Jesus is not teaching a set of beliefs alone. Beliefs are important, but Jesus is a Jewish teacher, and like all great Jewish teachers, he's not talking about just beliefs, he's talking about behaviors. "Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. A great fall was it." Now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, Matthew says, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. So this is the place you start. When you're reading through Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, the place to start is where Jesus ends, that this is reality. And how you construct your life actually does matter. It's not just a system of beliefs. It's something you construct. And the sermon is designed to answer, what does a disciple of Jesus actually look like?